Welcome. The Leadership Lesson podcast inspires leadership growth in everyone. We have enthralling conversations with top leaders in order to provide you with life-changing lessons. My name is Caleb Nichols. I'm a speaker, a pastor, and a family man. My hope is to inspire spiritual depth and leadership growth in you. I love to sit down with leaders from a variety of fields, hear their personal stories and leadership experiences. This creates the podcast. Enjoy. Well, welcome to the Leadership Lessons podcast. Our guest today is Jon Newton, who's a professor at Alphacrucis College. And get this, Jon is an academic expert on the book of Revelation. Very exciting. End times, Pentecostalism, all these kind of things Jon deals with. A little bit mouthwatering considering COVID and where we're at and where Christianity is at in these times. So really interested to talk to Jon today about a number of things. So welcome to the podcast, Jon. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be part of it.
Great. So Jon and I have actually known each other for going way back, more when I was a high school kid. I went to high school with a couple of your sons, didn't I, Jon? And
that's right.
So it's really nice to have you here, mate, and fascinated by your area of expertise. So maybe tell us first up, what is Eschatology? What's the book of Revelations about? Maybe you can give us a bit of a general insight there.
Sure. Well, eschatology comes from two Greek words and basically means the study of the last things. And so in Christian theology, that means the study of what happens to us after we die and what happens in the end of history, about second coming of Christ and a whole lot of stuff like that. Obviously, it's an area that's been debated quite a bit over the years, and there's been quite a lot of speculation at certain times of history, particularly when there's been particular crises on, or when particular significant dates are approaching, like 2000 was a big one, for example. And the book of Revelation obviously has something to say about that. One of the things people don't always get is that we talk about end times or the last days. According to the New Testament, the last days started with the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Yes.
And so we've been living in the last days for nearly 2,000 years. So we've got to be aware of that. And so theologians tend to differentiate between the already and the not yet. The thing God has already done through Christ. So he's already defeated death. He's already opened up salvation to us. He's already defeated the powers of darkness at the cross. So we don't have to look forward to those things in the future. They're already done. But there are other things that haven't happened yet. Obviously, we still live in mortal bodies. Obviously, we haven't been through the last judgment yet, and so on. So the borderline between those two things isn't always very precise, but it's something to remember. So when we go look at the book of Revelation, we've got to remember as well that the book of Revelation isn't necessarily all about the future. So there are four main competing ways of reading the book of Revelation by people who believe in the Bible. And many of us are familiar mainly with the idea that it's nearly all about the future. So, it's all about the second coming and the things around the second coming. But you need to be aware that there are good, strong Bible-believing scholars that hold the other three views. So one of them is historicism, and that's the view that Revelation is a detailed prediction of the history of the church mainly and the world, in the Western world mainly, because that's where it was originally sent to, and in a kind of symbolic code that starts in John's time in the first century and goes right through to the very end. Not that many scholars hold that view these days, but some do.
Can you give us an example of the symbolism in that reading of
All right.
Revelation?
Well, in that particular reading of Revelation, for example, when we read in Revelation 10 of a big angel coming down with a little scroll in his hand, he says to John, "Take this scroll and eat it, and then you'll prophesy further." That is taken by those sort of scholars to mean that's the Reformation, because that's when the Bible became available to the common person in their vernacular language, whether it be German or English or whatever. So they see that, so that you can make a case for some of those things.
Yeah.
Some of the others are a bit far-fetched when you try and read Napoleon or Hitler or stuff like that into Revelation. It's a bit. Then the third view is what's called preterism. It's probably the majority view of scholars, because it starts with the idea that where we approach any Bible book, or indeed any book of the ancient world, and that is to say, okay, what would the original audience have understood this to mean?
Yes.
So in this case, we look and say, okay, the original audience was 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia, in what is now Turkey, living in the latter part of the 1st century AD. So that immediately tends to knock out some of the more fanciful interpretations of Revelation. And a lot of work has been done, research work has been done over the last 50, 60 years that has shown a lot of potential links between things that were going on in those days and what John says in Revelation. However, not too many people are extreme preterists or full preterists, because there are things in Revelation, like the Last Judgment is the most obvious one, that obviously haven't happened yet. So that won't cover everything, but it does help. And then finally, idealism says, well, look, all of you guys are saying it relates to the future or the past or the whole sweep of history. Maybe you're all partly right. Maybe there isn't a specific, historical set of events being described here, but maybe it's talking about forces and things that keep happening over and over again in Christian history. So I tend to sort of find that fairly attractive. I don't think it's the total view. I think you probably can pick at least good elements out of all those views. But I think it's important that we don't speculate too much. And it's important to remember that Revelation is a book for one day and not just for us today.
Yes. And you've written a commentary, which you've recently released on the book of Revelation. So we're talking to an expert here. You must have spent years and years in this book, studying it and looking at it from every angle.
That's right. Well, I've actually written 3 books about the book of Revelation.
Wow.
The first one, the easiest to read, was called Revelation Reclaimed, came out in 2009. It's a fairly polemical book. It's like, here are some bad ways of reading Revelation that are common around the place. Don't do this. And then a few positive suggestions near the end. And then secondly, the Revelation Worldview, which is based on my PhD thesis.
Fantastic.
It's more about a conversation between the book of Revelation and postmodernism, and we're basically trying to say, okay, as Christians in this era we're living in, how should we think? And can Revelation help us with that? So it's a bit more philosophical. And then, as you say, beginning of this year, this little book, the commentary on Revelation, it's the first of a new series of Pentecostal commentaries on the Bible. And so I'm specifically trying to approach Revelation as a Pentecostal, but not copying what a lot of Pentecostals have done in the past, because I think some of it has been a bit misguided. Trying to think, okay, how should a Pentecostal who believes in the power of the Holy Spirit and reaching the world for Christ, how should they interpret the book of Revelation? So, and that
I find, John, and especially with COVID, we're recording this at the end of 2021, coming out of lockdowns here in Melbourne, where we both live, and I've found just absolutely fascinating, mind-blowing, how some Christians and especially Pentecostals have interpreted Revelation in this time, drawing parallels with COVID and vaccinations and 666 being QR codes, and just these, very joining dots that obviously should never be joined. What do you think Pentecostals are more, I suppose, likely to join dots like that? Do you think there's something about the Holy Spirit infused Christianity that draws us to be more speculative, or maybe misuse the book of Revelation? Or has it not been a misuse? I mean, what are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, well, I think the problem with Pentecostals is that we've drawn a lot of our eschatology from the what you might call the fundamentalist wing of the church, particularly in America, and we haven't really thought about it strongly as Pentecostals, because Pentecostalism was kind of infected over the last 100 years with what's called dispensationalism. So that's a view that is very pessimistic about the chances of the church during this age. It basically sees the church as in major trouble and finally rescued by Jesus' second coming. Won't go into great detail about that, but that view is in great tension with what Pentecostals have always believed about latter rain outpourings and great moves of God across the world and stuff like that. So those two things have always been kind of creating a tension amongst Pentecostals. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote this commentary, to kind of try and redress the balance a little bit. So getting back to your actual question, though, I think that the reason why Pentecostals are susceptible to conspiracy theories and the like is because we have bought into this kind of fundamentalist, futurist kind of way of reading Revelation. But I was very surprised recently. I've just taken part in an interdenominational study on conspiracy theories and Christians.
Wow.
Most of the people in the study were, I think, evangelical Anglicans. But I was surprised to find that the problems we're having in Pentecostal churches are not unique to us. That in other branches of the church, similar, if not identical, things are happening. And I think the problem is that this pandemic that we've just been going through is causing everybody to raise a lot of questions about what is God doing and where are we at, and is Jesus about to come again, and what about the antichrist, and of course, governments have been putting huge restrictions on what we can and can't do, and has made people very, very wary and very anxious.
Yes.
Well, so when we're in a situation like that, it always heightens interest in eschatology and the book of Revelation. Yes. Now, that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. Because people are asking the big questions. What is going to happen to me when I die? Because now, with this COVID, I might die. So what's going to happen to me when I die? What is happening in the world today? Are we about to lose our freedoms, etc., etc.? So I think it's good that people are asking those questions, but I think we've got to look at the book of Revelation intelligently, and we've got to look at it and use the same kinds of hermeneutical rules we would use for, let's say, 1 Corinthians. Revelation is not some kind of weird thing that no understand. Yes, it's a different genre to, say, Corinthians, okay? And it has got a lot of symbolism and imagery and all the rest of it. No doubt about that. But it's not written in Martian. It's understandable, providing that we don't always try and translate everything into what we might call propositional type language. In other words, we've got to remember that Revelation appeals to our imagination more than to our brain, to our right brain, so to speak.
Yes.
So provided we do that, and we remember that it was written to an audience 2,000 years ago, and therefore we've got to ask, first of all, what would they have thought of it? Providing we follow those basic rules, I think it's a good thing.
And is that where you think things get wrong, John, or get out of hand, when the genre is misunderstood and the usual exegetical tools are not understood? Because I think for me as a pastor, I've definitely tried to think through the last few months, why are people that I'm talking to, Christians I'm talking to, other pastors even I'm talking to, there's been no real comment around eschatology, recently. And then all of a sudden, COVID comes, a crisis, and there's just, what I would consider absurd statements by some even pastors around, talking about the Greek word pharmakia that's used in Revelations 18 as aligning that with the vaccine, and just, pastors even saying, you know, I'm sure you're aware of the pitfalls of social media. So pastors putting things on social media about this being the end times and signs of the end times. And so would you say it's the misunderstanding of the genre, or just the getting caught, overly caught in our imaginations? Is that where we go wrong with the book of Revelations? Or
I think the first thing is, as you said yourself, we've been kind of caught by surprise. So you may or may not remember, 20, 30 years ago, all the Pentecostal churches were constantly talking about end times. And we had people like Barry Smith and others that were coming through and drawing large crowds to Pentecostal churches. The problem was that Barry, like a lot of people, took Revelation to be a prediction of the future. Now, there is some of that in it, but that's not the main thing Revelation is about, predicting the future in our days anyway.
yes.
So when you start using it that way, you always are going to run into trouble. And that's what my first book was basically trying to expose, bad ways that people read Revelation. Then, of course, what Barry and others said was going to happen didn't happen. So people realized, oh, we don't understand this book after all. So they stopped preaching about it. They stopped preaching at end times. You know, for the last 20 years, you probably hardly ever heard a sermon on Pentecostal pastor. Then all of a sudden, this hits. And of course, what have they got to draw on? Well, they go back and draw on some of the things they learned 20, 30 years ago. Well, hang on, it didn't work then. It's not going to work now. I've got to think this through properly. I've got to go back and not use Revelation in that kind of way. So getting back to what you said about genre, does Revelation predict the future? Well, to some degree, yes. But if you look at the first verse, the first couple of verses, it's obviously talking mainly about the near future. In other words, what was going to happen in John's own day. Now, that doesn't exhaust it. As I said, there's stuff near the end that's clearly hasn't happened yet. But generally, that's where we have to start. But also, Revelation is a letter. It says in about verse 7, I think, John to the 7 churches, just 4. John to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace and peace. It could have just been like Paul writing a letter. So again, that emphasizes it's a letter to them, not to us.
Yes.
We can learn from it, just like we can learn from the letter to the Corinthians or the Ephesians or wherever. But we've got to remember, first of all, what does it mean to them? Thirdly, it's what's called an apocalypse. So the very first verse says calls it a revelation. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean something, because we use the word apocalyptic these days in a very colloquial sense, to mean big stuff, going wrong everywhere. That's not what it meant in John's day. What it meant was it's a kind of revelation or an unveiling of what God is up to, and what God wants us to say. And Revelation can still help us think what God is doing in the world, again, providing that we interpret it well. I also see that Revelation is like a story. It has characters, it has a plot, it has an ending. And so reading it that way helps, again, to not jump to conclusions about a particular part of Revelation. People say, where are we up to in Revelation? Are we up to the 6th seal, or the 5th trumpet, or the 3rd book, or whatever? I'm going, those are probably not very helpful questions. And they eventually lead to speculation.
Yes. I think going back to you were saying we haven't heard anything much for the last 20 or 30 years. It's funny, John, because I've found myself saying to people recently, I feel like I'm back in my childhood. I feel like I'm in the charismatic kind of 80s, growing up in the church, hearing all these absurd things. Not that I thought they were absurd at the time, I was just a kid, but obviously as you grow up and you study the word of God for yourself, you start to realize, this isn't really saying what they told me it says, and so you've really got to rethink. So it has been an amazing just kind of grab back at the 80s and 90s with some really old understandings of these things. And I've actually been studying a little bit of theology myself lately, some postgraduate stuff, and I've just done a course on systematic theology, and we had a week on the end times, on eschatology, or the last things, or whatever you want to call it. And the lecturer said a great line, which I thought was very helpful, about Revelations and apocalyptic genre, and just really saying that it's in a sense, it's God, the God of the future, or who God is. I mean, God is eternal, breaking into the now in a way. So it's a foretaste of what is to come. So, for instance, the imagery in Revelation of Christ coming on a white horse with the sword coming from his mouth, it's probably unlikely that that will be a literal thing that will occur in the future, but the imagery of a victorious Christ coming back as King of the universe, we know that as Christians, but it's a foretaste of that happening again at the end of time in the second coming. I think that really helped probably give me something to, as a bit of an anchor. And a lot of apocalyptic writing, or prophetic writing, I suppose, in that sense, is like that, isn't it? We know the truth, but this is a picture of the truth in the future that we understand in the now, and it's a foretaste of what we're heading into, and we're growing into, or the bride of Christ is being perfected into. Would I be on the right track there?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I feel God showed me years ago, I was actually listening to a sermon at the time, which had nothing to do with Revelation, but you know how sermons, sometimes you just spark something off in your mind and you're lost. And one of the things I realized is that book of Revelation ends with a wedding. You've got the bride of Christ and the returning lamb, and there's this wedding in Revelation 19 and in 21. So what kind of literature ends with a wedding? Well, obviously romance. And so I thought, that's a funny way of looking at Revelation. Does it work? And I went through and I found it did work, surprisingly, as a way of looking. Again, it's a storyline, like I said before, but a romance story means obviously you've got a bride and a bridegroom. Well, we know what that is. And then it opened up for me to see the purpose of the book of Revelation is not to give us information about the future. Right? It's not to kind of help us, work out where we are in history. It's rather to challenge us and stir us to a really strong discipling love for Jesus. So it's a very similar purpose to the rest of the New Testament.
Yes.
Surprise. It's in the New Testament. So that, as you rightly said, Revelation isn't bringing us some brand new doctrine that isn't in the rest of the Bible. It's basically restating what the Bible itself says. And it's like a story. It's also like the end of a bigger story. I think Revelation was deliberately written to be the last book in the Bible. It might have been the last book written, we don't know. But it's the way it finishes suggests that I'm finishing the story of what started in Genesis. And again, if you think about that in the romance line, God has all the way been looking for a bride. Okay, it was meant to be all humanity, then it was meant to be Israel, now it's meant to be the church. Not that God's abandoned those other things, don't get me wrong. But so because of that, Jesus wants a bride that's passionate about him. That's why in the Gospels, Jesus makes very strong demands on his disciples, doesn't he? If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. All that sort of language. Well, Revelation has very similar language. And the heroes of the book of Revelation are not people who are safely kind of raptured out of the world before all the bad things happen. The heroes of the book of Revelation are people who give their lives.
Yes.
For faith.
Shed their blood.
Revelation 12:11, these Christians overcame him, the devil, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives so long as to die.
Amazing.
So that, to me, just that one verse sums up a lot of what Revelation is about, and not
very good.
A lot of the false teachings that we get.
Yeah, I love that. I love that as a key verse that captures maybe the meaning of the book. I think it's just such, even hearing you say it again, it's just such a powerful verse, isn't it? I mean, that's the core
of Christianity. That's the core of the gospel right there in the book of Revelation. And I think it's to our own detriment as Christians that we run off with these unhelpful interpretations of these things. And I think it's sad to see Christians or Pentecostals try and bend these things into the modern day and try and make them. I think the frustrating thing for me is when people also try and make these things this kind of special prophetic insight that maybe only some people have had, or only some people get that the vaccine is a certain thing, or get that this government overseas is. I think it's really unhelpful. It's not the gospel. It's not really the word of God. God isn't, no one has a monopoly on his word or a prophetic insight that is superior to everyone else. And but can we get a little bit down into the grassroots of the book of Revelation? So I know some people will be listening going, what about the mark of the beast and some of these things? Like, could you give us, I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but could you give us a little bit, some thoughts around the mark of the beast and the antichrist and those scriptures, those difficult ones?
Okay, let's have a go at it. Well, first of all, if you're going to have a mark of the beast, you've got to have a beast. That's the first question I say. Well, who is the beast? If you think that the vaccine is taking the mark of the beast, for example, what beast? Okay, so we've got to remember the beast in Revelation, okay, obviously is a force or power that is trying to get everybody to worship it and indeed worship the devil, and is putting incredible pressure on all the Christians to do that, and not only all the Christians, but everybody in the world. And that pressure is not just, oh, you can't buy and sell if you don't have the mark of the beast. No, you're actually going to get killed if you don't have the mark of the beast. So whatever it means, let's not trivialize it by putting it onto something like this vaccine thing, which is very, very small beer by comparison. The second thing I'd like to say is, when we read the passage about the mark of the beast, and it's a very serious warning, a lot of the time we don't read it in context. In particular, the chapter divisions in the Bible sometimes get in our way. You've got to remember there were no chapters and verses in the original text.
Yes.
So the very next verse after the mark of the beast is chapter 14, verse 1, where you have 144,000 people, and they have the name of God and Christ written on their foreheads. Now, I don't ever remember anybody making a conspiracy theory about that.
That's true.
And that's mentioned more times in Revelation than the mark of the beast. So if we're going to say the mark of the beast is, a vaccine or some kind of, stuff under your skin, and, all these different theories come up. Well, hang on. Is the mark of God like that? So if you're going to take one literally, quote unquote, are you going to take the other literally? Otherwise, you're being very inconsistent.
Yeah.
And the big point about that, though, is if you've got the mark of God, you won't fall for the mark of the beast. In other words, if your life is 100% committed to Jesus Christ, and your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, as Revelation 13 talks about, you are not going to take the mark of the beast. So you don't think you might accidentally take it one day.
Yeah.
No, it's always connected to loyalty to God versus loyalty to some other force. So, for example, in the about 20 or 30 years after Revelation was written, in a very nearby province of the Roman Empire, I'll just tell you this little story. The governor of the province was a guy called Pliny the Younger, and he was having a big problem because the Christians were growing very fast in his particular part of the empire, and it was getting so bad that no one was going to the temples, no one was offering the sacrifices, and no one was buying the meat that came from the temple because the Christians wouldn't touch it. So he felt, I've got to come down on these people, and so, of course, so he started making strict rules, about Christians and about the rest of it, and about people meeting secretly and a whole lot of stuff. But of course, what happens then, as we see today in Pakistan, you make a rule like that, people will use the rule to fight their own private fights. So in Pakistan, a lot of Christians end up in trouble because they're accused of blaspheming the Quran, because there's a rule about that. Well, I don't like you. I'm going to accuse you because I know you're a Christian. You know, it's got nothing to do with religion, really. It's just a private feud. Well, the same thing was happening there. People were dobbing their neighbors into being Christians when they weren't. So he came up with a test. He said, these are 3 things that a Christian won't do. So if a person is accused of being a Christian and they deny it, I'm going to test them on these 3 things. First of all, will they deny Christ? No Christian will do that. Secondly, will they offer sacrifice to the gods? A Christian won't do that. Thirdly, will they offer incense before a statue of Caesar? A Christian won't do that. So I think that worked quite well, actually. It sorted the sheep out from the goats.
Yeah.
And it pulled a few nominal Christians back from their faith. And many of the ones who then said, no, I am a Christian, I'm proud of it, they got killed.
Wow.
Sounds very similar to Revelation 13, doesn't it? So there was no physical mark, but there was a test of loyalty. And that's what the mark of the beast ultimately is. It's a test of loyalty. And that's why the mark of God in the next verse, okay, that's the opposite loyalty. Are we loyal to God and Christ, or are we loyal to the state or someone else, first of all?
Fantastic.
And that's serious. It's life and death.
Well explained. Yeah, it's great. I really like that. So what about the beast or the antichrist? How does that fit into that?
Well, first of all, just a very small point, the word antichrist is never used in the book of Revelation. It's only used in 1st and 2nd John. And in those places, it's describing people who were Christians, probably preachers, who've abandoned the faith or compromised the faith in some way. So it's a religious term, not a political term as such. Now, the beast in Revelation is something different again. I think it is a political term primarily, although it has a religious side, because you've got to remember in those days, religion and politics were not separated like we have.
Yes.
You know, the Roman Empire was built on the foundation of the gods who they believed favored them and gave them this massive empire. So whatever the beast was in those days, and I think it was the Roman Empire or one of the Roman emperors, perhaps specifically Nero. He's a good candidate. He was the very first emperor to persecute Christians, and 666 can be the number of his name. It's a little bit convoluted, so we wouldn't want to, be too dogmatic about that. But it fits really well. And that's why I think there have been many beasts in history. You know, I think if you lived in Germany in the 1930s, Hitler was acting very beastly. In France and Europe in the end of the 18th century, Napoleon might be a good candidate. But I think we've got to be very, very careful here. Again, people are trying to make political points. Like I remember when Barack Obama was the president of America, a lot of people, he might be the beast. Funnily enough, I never heard anyone say that about Donald Trump. And yet by the very criteria most of them used, he actually fitted better than anybody else, because he was the one that was producing peace things with Israel. I think that's a lot of rubbish, but you know what I mean? But if they were consistent, they should have had a go at him. So I think we are looking at political power that demands worship and excessive loyalty.
Yes.
You know, probably the nearest one today would probably be Xi Jinping in China, who's basically forcing churches to take crosses down and put up his picture instead and things like that. That I don't think he's quite there yet, but he is moving in that kind of direction. Again, we're talking about serious issues. We're talking about what might be, you might get killed. And therefore, I think that Christians living in China or North Korea, even worse, and places like that, can probably understand this a lot better than those of us living in the fairly comfortable Western
Yeah, it's a big, I think, yeah, we have to make a big stretch in our very comfortable world to try and make something a beast or call something a tyrant, where you're right, they understand these things a lot better.
I think that Revelation does warn us about excessive political power. So I think we have every right to be anxious about the way the governments in Australia are using the powers given to them through the pandemic. I think we've got to be every right to be anxious about this new law that's just been passed in Victoria. But let's not overstate it. Let's keep a sense of proportion here. This is not the beast. This, you are not going to be killed if you don't do what Daniel Andrews tells you to do, for example. Let's keep a sense of proportion. That's what I'd like to say.
I think for me, that where proportion is lost, it seems to be far more of a psychological issue than a spiritual issue. So where people are overreaching with their interpretations of Bible revelations, COVID, Daniel Andrews, I think it seems to me, all the conspiracy theories you mentioned earlier, it seems to be more of a psychological way of coping, probably with the crisis. And there's obviously a lot of scientific evidence around conspiracy theories and dealing with crisis, and it's more of a psychological ploy to give some certainty or anchoring maybe in a time of crisis. I think that the challenge as a Christian is, we really believe in the Bible, we believe in the supernatural realm, and maybe there's a bit of a intermeshing of these things with some psychological trying to survive, as we've all been trying to through the last couple of years. And you get this kind of odd mix, and you've said it a couple of times today, John, about thinking through things properly, and as any good academic would, I've said to many of my friends in the little bit of study I've done, like when you're writing academic essays and things like that, very much the tone is not an absolute tone. It's very much this scholar suggested this, and this has been postulated, and nothing's ever held so firm, because we're trying to learn, we're being open, we're building on each other's research, and where, you don't get that sometimes as much when things are more of an emotional response. It's very absolute. Daniel Andrews is, and the pandemic is, and the book of Revelation says, and it's all very concrete, which isn't very helpful, especially for in my role as a pastor, when it comes to discipleship and with openness and growth. Growth doesn't come very well through absolute claims. It comes through humility and openness and learning and prayer and dialogue and these kind of things. So
having said that, I mean, there are absolutes though that we do hold to. So I have a little phrase that I picked up somewhere over the years that I often use when I'm teaching this sort of area, and that is, the plain things are the main things, and the main things are the plain things. Now, I would die for the resurrection of Jesus. I would die for the second coming. I would die for some of these other major truths about Jesus being God. These are clear things that are stated in the Bible that every Christian knows these things are true, and therefore they are absolutes that we can hold on to. The problem is other Christians get absolutist about things that they have no right to be absolute, like pre-millennial, post-millennial, pre-tribulation, all this sort of stuff. Well, have a view by all means, work out what you think it's saying, but don't say, anyone who doesn't agree with me isn't a proper Christian or something like that. So that's where I draw the line. So we've got to be careful. And obviously in our postmodern era, the whole idea of absolute truth is being thrown out. I think that's dangerous for Christians. I think we've got to be careful that we don't compromise on the things that are plain in Scripture. On the other hand, that we don't absolutize things that are not so plain.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Now, getting back to Revelations, what about Revelation 17:18, the Great Prostitute, the 10 horns? Can you give us a little bit of a insight there? What this is probably talking about?
Well, once again, it's probably largely about Rome. Because it says at the end of chapter 17 that she is the city that's ruling over the kings of the world. Well, that's obviously a reference to Rome. Earlier on, it talks about the 7 mountains that she's sitting on, and so on. So it's probably almost certainly there are some scholars who think it's about Jerusalem, and Jerusalem because Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome in AD 70. It's possible, but I don't think it's the main thing that's been got at there. Also, though, but like everything in Revelation, it probably has multiple potential applications. Now, we know that in the post-Reformation era, a lot of people took this to be the Roman Catholic Church. You know, if you were living in some parts of Europe in those days under the Inquisition, for example, you might have had good reason for thinking that. I think it was a stretch then, and it's a much bigger stretch now to take that view, although there are still people who do. So it's, again, it's what are you comparing it with? Okay, let me just take this back a step. When we read the book of Revelation, one of the clear things that we see about it, I mentioned about a romance story, but another one is a war story. Revelation is full of wars and fighting and violence. And ultimately, that violence is a spiritual battle between God and the devil, to oversimplify a bit. And Revelation shows us a number of ways the devil tries to get his way in the world. So one of them is by persecution and oppression. Okay, if you don't worship me, you're dead, that sort of thing. So Revelation 13 is all about that. The second way is through deception. In Revelation 12, he's called the one who deceives the whole world. Again, we also said in Revelation 13, when the second beast brings big signs like fire from heaven and stuff like that, deceiving the people into thinking that the beast is actually divine. But the third way the devil has, and these all go back to the very beginning of Genesis too, is what I call seduction. In other words, if you cooperate with me, I'll make life easy for you. Okay. Now, if we look at what's going on in Australia right now, we see a little bit of oppression, maybe. Okay. We see a fair bit of deception going on, but probably the main thing we see is seduction. The devil seduces us through our capitalistic consumption culture, makes us soft as Christians, and therefore we're not passionate about following Jesus. We are a bit like the church in Laodicea, which was comfortable and wealthy, and therefore they lost their dependence on the Lord, and Jesus was actually shut out from the church. Now, I'm not saying that there's some kind of, staged system going on here. Don't misunderstand me. But I do think that problem that the church of Laodicea had is probably more the problem that the Western church has today. And I think that the prostitute in Revelation 17 and 18 is that particular strategy of the enemy, using luxury and goods and trading and consumption to seduce us and bring us into the world system.
Yeah, it's a very graphic picture of great prostitute, giant harlot, in some translations, drawing in the kings of the earth and seducing them and consuming them almost. And I like what you're saying there, John, that understanding of the seduction. And you're right, in our modern, postmodern world, it is a really big problem for us as Christians and in the church. So why talking about postmodernism, what was the main reason that you wrote the book, drawing together postmodernism and this culture we live in with the book of Revelation? What really inspired you to write that book? And we'll link all of your books in the description for anyone who wants to look them up or purchase.
Fantastic. Well, it started life as my PhD thesis, and the original decision was somewhat pragmatic. I wanted to study under a particular guy at Deakin University, and because Deakin didn't have a theology school, I couldn't do pure theology. I really wanted to do something on the book of Revelation. So I came up with this idea of how about I try and link Revelation with postmodernism. Now, there's two good reasons for doing that. First of all, Revelation is one of the most un-postmodern books in the Bible. So it's full of absolutes and threatening things and heaven and hell and, you know, God and the devil, all that sort of stuff that postmodernism really hates. But then secondly, Revelation has been, of all books in the Bible, the one that's been subject to the most different interpretations and contradictory interpretations, which of course is something postmodernism really likes to highlight about any piece of literature. There's no one meaning to anything. No, it could be, depends on who's reading it, what that means. So it actually helped me to actually, and I didn't know a lot about postmodernism when I started on this journey. But the more I read about postmodernism and I read about Revelation, I realized that, okay, I could get these two things kind of talking to each other. It's a bit artificial, but and addressing some of the big questions. It's called the Revelation Worldview because that was the word that best summed up what Revelation and postmodernism were talking about. So in other words, what is real? How do we know anything? What is a human person? Where is history going? How do we deal with people who disagree with us? These are some of the big questions that any worldview has to answer. Revelation provides us with a series of answers on that. And in fact, the whole Bible does, but I couldn't take the whole Bible. And postmodernism gives us a completely, not always completely different, sometimes somewhat similar idea to the Bible. So it enabled me to have this discussion and to, it ended up almost an apologetic kind of book. Okay, Christianity has something useful to say in this postmodern era, and this book of Revelation can help us say it.
Yeah, fantastic. Really interesting. When in this postmodern era, where do you think the church is at in Australia, or maybe Pentecostalism's particularly your field of interest? Where do you think we're at?
Well, I think Pentecostalism has tapped into the postmodern era better than any other form of Christianity, and that's why it's growing so rapidly, because we have a lot of stress on emotion, experience, and not so much stress on truth, which is a danger, but it also has an advantage. Okay. So if you're a postmodern person and you're getting a little bit interested in Christianity, you're probably more likely to go to Hillsong than to, say, your local Presbyterian church, just for argument's sake. But of course, the danger with that is Pentecostals is that we get swallowed up by postmodernism and that we neglect truth. And I think that that is a danger in many Pentecostal churches that we have fallen into to some degree. I think we do need to get back and think, okay, what do we actually believe to be true? And I think a lot of Pentecostal pastors are now seeing that and realizing that it's not good enough just to give people good feelings and experiences. They need to have some solid truth. Now, of course, a lot of the other parts of the church, and again, I'm overgeneralizing. So if you're watching this and you go to a different church, please don't be offended with what I'm about to say. But I think some parts of the church are still living in what we call the modern era. That is where reason and science define everything. Now that is still around, that idea, in Western society, but it's gradually being superseded by the idea that there is no such thing as absolute truth, and that we don't learn primarily or only through reason, and that even reason varies from place to place and from century to century. And a lot of the modern views, say in the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment, for example, were dominated mainly by what we call white Western men. So postmodernism is saying, well, hang on a minute. Well, in that case, there must be other ways of looking at truth which are equally valid. That can be a great opportunity for the Christian gospel to come in, for us to say, well, here is one of those. What do you think of this? And rather than try and prove it to them, we'd say, okay, here's this Christian story. Doesn't it make sense? Doesn't it help?
Mm.
Then they have to decide.
I think in my experience, I love that. I think that's great, John. And I think in my experience, part of the problem as well for your modern Australian is they really trip over the church.
Yes.
So trying to bring and I try and help my congregation with this, bringing Jesus, bringing the core tenets of the gospel, Son of God, and he rose from the dead, just that simple faith that we do a lot of worldview stuff around God's big story and the story of Jesus, whatever. But getting to that, being able to even share that story is very difficult the minute the word church is used. I was just met with a family this morning for a funeral I'm going to do next week, and it's through my local soccer club, and it's a very typical kind of story where the older man who's passed away probably grew up going to Sunday school, probably grew up technically as a Christian, cultural Christian, we might say.
Yeah.
But they really just rejected everything more because the church and the institution and the whole thing just, so they've kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater. The core beliefs aren't really even assessed or thought about or considered because there's just the whole religious thing is just don't really need it. So it's maybe some of where I see the challenge a little bit at the moment for the church in modern Australia.
I don't disagree with you. And, it says somewhere that judgment must begin at the house of God. And I think that God is cleaning us up. Let's face it, the church has had a lot of bad publicity, and obviously the child abuse stuff, particularly in the Catholic Church, but not exclusively, has been a major issue. But the major issue, people don't like to belong, and people don't like to be told what to think or what to do by any institution. So people are, and that's not only affecting the church, it's affecting lots of other groups. Lots of people these days are not joining. I read a really interesting article from New Zealand a few years back, that the number of people taking part in rugby clubs in New Zealand, now, rugby is virtually a New Zealand's national religion, number of people taking part is dropping substantially. So people will go and watch a game because that's not a commitment. They won't join a club because then I've got to follow some rules and I've got to, go to a meeting every week or whatever. People don't like making commitments. That's part of the whole postmodern ethos. We just remain cool and uncommitted. We keep a distance from anybody who tries to put anything on us. So I think that's another problem that the church is facing. And of course, the technology that we have even in the church now means that if someone wants to, they don't have to go to church. They can just sit and watch Brian Houston or whoever on TV. They don't have to give any money. They don't have to believe any particular doctrine. They don't have to sign anything. It's very, very laid back. Now, that's a real problem for us because we don't want people just to join the church as an institution. On the other hand, we can't give them an easy believism. Jesus demands loyalty. He demands you give him your 100% commitment. And that's, again, what Book of Revelation makes very, very plain. But not only plain, it's the whole New Testament has screaming that message at you all the time. So we've somehow got to balance the fact that, yes, the church is kind of relative in a sense, that the church is imperfect, that the church has got some scandals in its history, some skeletons in the closet, and people know what they are, so they're not exactly in the closet. Of course, people don't realize, though, how much we owe to the church.
Yes.
They don't realize that modern science was born in a Christian worldview culture. They don't realize that nearly all of our health, education, justice laws have come out of Christians agitating and churches modeling this kind of thing.
It's not popular right now to hear that.
It's not popular, but it's very hard
truths aren't popular right now.
So you you can't tell them that unless they're already sort of halfway there. But so I think we've just got to live it out.
Yes.
Show people by our love.
Yeah.
Not our love for them, but also our love for each other. The more Christians fight each other, the more that's a turn off to the rest of the world.
It's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge.
But I also think it's very exciting, guys.
It is. It is. I'm excited.
We have incredible possibilities, particularly as Pentecostals, to demonstrate what Christianity is all about.
Yeah. Well, so in my generation, John, late 30s, early 40s, grown up in Pentecostal churches, kind of childhood during the more charismatic kind of era of the 80s, the prophetic type 90s, you know, this kind of thing. I've found a lot of my peers, pastors my age, friends my age, there's a level of disillusionment with the Pentecostalism, with the style, with the approach. I think it is amazing, as you mentioned before, that Pentecostalism is the fastest growing globally it's the fastest growing arm of the church. And I think for good reason, for sure. I totally agree with you. The weakness, as you mentioned before, is maybe emotion trumping truth at times, or maybe there's not a lot of desire to go into the difficult issues and church discipline, or preach about divorce being sin, or these kind of things are not very popular issues in our modern culture, and maybe Pentecostalism brushes over some of those things. But I think the disillusionment that I'm hearing from a lot of my generation that I talk to is more around the prophetic stuff, the apostolic stuff, the being parented by our parents that was very much, demon hunting, and The Simpsons is evil, and there's no Halloween, and a lot of these, everything was spiritualized. And I don't know, are we just caught in some postmodern thing? Is there some truth to that Pentecostalism maybe is maturing, or have you seen it maturing in a way? I do have to remind some people that Pentecostalism is actually fairly young in Australia. Really, it's really a post-World War II phenomenon in a lot of ways, isn't it? So maybe it's maturing a bit. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think Pentecostalism is maturing. The first Pentecostal church in Australia, by the way, was started in 1909 in North Melbourne. The building is still there. They didn't build it; they just rented it or something. But it's now a Catholic building called the Legion of Mary. So you can go and find it sometime if you're interested. Obviously, after that, there was a series of revivals in the 20s and 30s that really got Pentecostalism going in Australia. But it didn't take off much until the late 70s. I'm doing a lot of study myself at the moment on that period from 1970 to now. But Pentecostalism, it came out of a fairly lively holiness kind of stream of Christianity. In Australia, most of them had been Methodists. And Methodism, of course, doesn't exist hardly any longer, but it's part of what became eventually the Uniting Church. And these were people who really were looking for a more serious form of Christianity that had real power to it. But of course, the problem with that and the focus on the experience, which is always been central in Pentecostalism, spirit baptism specifically, but also speaking in tongues, healing, prophecy, and other experiences. The problem with it always has been discerning what's good and what's not so good, and balancing that up against the Bible. I remember a famous statement was made by a particular scholar years ago who had been a Pentecostal. He said, "I want to give thanks to the Pentecostals who taught me how to love the Bible, and to the Presbyterians who taught me how to understand it." Like all such clever sayings, it's radically oversimplifies things. But I do think that Pentecostals have not been very good at analysing and interpreting the Bible up until fairly recently. But it is changing. A lot of Pentecostal ministers are now getting degrees, whereas before that was uncommon. Here in Australia, we have, if I can just give me some free advertising, Alphacrucis College that I work for can take you right through to a PhD. And so it's just one example of Pentecostalism becoming more sophisticated, more intelligent, more balanced, more, rational, without being rationalistic, and therefore having more to say to our world out there. Now, it remains controversial, and obviously, if you ask people in Australia if they know anything about Pentecostals, the three names that would come up would be Brian Houston, Margaret Court, and Scott Morrison. Now, all three of those people are very controversial for different reasons. So we are controversial, and I think it's a good thing because at least it makes people think and go, well, who are these people? And I'm going to write a book about that too. But,
great.
But yeah, I think that we do have some baggage though from the past, and we've listed some of those things. And look, I was involved myself. I'm a Pentecostal pastor. I've got 5 children, and some of my children have been disillusioned by those same propensities to claim too much. I think, we've got to be so careful we don't overblow our claims about healing, about prophecy, about tongues, etc. On the other hand, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and jettison those things that have made us strong and vibrant in the first place. And I think that's the balance that Pentecostals are trying to find today. But just for the sake of your audience here, it's important to realize that Pentecostalism is growing gangbusters, mainly in the majority world. So in Latin America, in Africa, in parts of Asia, and in parts of the Middle East. Fastest growing church in the world right now is in Iran.
So I've heard. Amazing.
And it's largely Pentecostal in its way. They may not call themselves that any more than the church in China doesn't call itself Pentecostal. It's also growing. There's probably 100 million Pentecostal type Christians in China right now, and doesn't get a lot of press.
It's amazing. And I think that openness to the Holy Spirit is obviously a huge key to that. And that's obviously what we love about Pentecostalism, is at the end of the day, there's a real openness to the Holy Spirit, to the supernatural. We try not to get bogged down unnecessarily in natural things. And that I think allows for incredible faith, incredible moves of God, incredible belief in the unseen and the prophetic future and all these things. But I think, the disillusionment with my generation is a bit more, as you said, around those things maybe being stretched too far, being used inappropriately, even abused. I would look back at some things and go, I think it was abusive in the sense of, positions, prophecies, these things were used to manipulate and coerce. And I think that's probably even where we're at now as a society, we're just a little bit more aware of those things as well. And we look into the church and go, even parenting styles being a bit coercive, using scriptures, scare tactics to get kids to behave right during their teenage and young adult years, things like that, probably backfired to a degree. But I'm really excited, John. As you said, Pentecostalism's got a lot to offer the world. Hopefully it's maturing, and I would love to be part of the church in that way, the body of Christ in that way, to help it grow up a bit. I've been doing all my study with the Trinity College, so with the Anglicans, which I've done on purpose because I really wanted a very different angle than what I was used to. And as you said before, with your quote about the Presbyterians, and I find they're far better understanding of the Bible, far deeper, far more rational than my experience with Pentecostal. So I've really enjoyed that. It's helped me a lot.
I've got some friends there.
Yeah, you would. It's great. I liked what you said about Pentecostalism maybe becoming a bit more intelligent as well. And I know you mean that totally in the right, godly kind of way, but I think there's definitely something in that just learning to think a little bit more. I've pushed a lot more with my church the last few years, especially with understanding worldviews. It's helped a lot, pushed a lot more, the importance of the head, the importance of understanding that God isn't just a God of the heart in the Pentecostal sense. It's all heart, all emotion, but he's also, he gave us a brain, and we renew our minds, and thinking is important, and understanding what experts have said is important. It's not just all about prayer lines at the end of church services. And, so
very good.
Maybe we can finish off, John. Just tell us, did you want to say something else there? Sorry.
Oh, no, I just was basically agreeing with you, and just pointing out that Pentecostalism is starting to produce some really world-renowned scholars.
Great.
So, Amos Yong, for example, who's an Assemblies of God minister in America, who is from a Malaysian Chinese background. Family migrated to America when he was a child, and he's now one of the top theologians in the world. Frank Markia, another American, but there are some emerging great scholars here in Australia as well. Some of your listeners may have heard of Jackie Gray, who works at Alphacrucis College, who's one of the top female Bible scholars, particularly on the Old Testament in Australia. So we are in the arena now with the older colleges and scholars, and I think it's wonderful what God is doing through Pentecostals and charismatics. Craig Keener, for example, is a guy who I've got to know a little bit. He's one of these annoying people who writes 2 or 3 books in a year, and they're not thin. Anyway, enough of that.
No, it's great. Well, I've really appreciated you having on the podcast, John. We'll have to have you back. You got plenty to share. And I think on the church, the book of Revelation, Pentecostalism, it's really, really fascinating. So we really appreciate your time. I'll link your books in the description if anyone wants to look them up or purchase them. And thank you for your contribution to the church and the kingdom of God, especially here in Australia. It's great to have a man of your stature. So thank you for being with us.
Can I add one little thing at the end?
Yeah.
Another research project I'm doing at the moment is we're interviewing all the older Pentecostal ministers that we can find around Australia to tell the story of how and why Pentecostalism grew over the last 50 years. Amazing stories that'll blow your socks off. Incredible.
Right. And when are you looking to release that, John?
Hopefully early 2023.
Great.
Just about finished doing all the interviews now. So now we've got to cull them all down. I've got well over 1 million words.
Wow.
Nobody's going to read that. So I've got to get down to some manageable state, and then hopefully early 2023.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, mate.
No worries. Thank you. God bless you.
Thanks.
I trust you were impacted by that Leadership Lessons podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's podcast. Please comment down below, and please review the podcast and share it with a friend. Doing this inspires us and helps others to find the podcast. See you next time.